we're going to start, you're just in time. We're going to start Amy Carmichael. Who has not heard of Amy Carmichael? I'm assuming, Mary, you have never heard of her? Okay.
I don't know any about missions.
Okay, that's all right, man. Actually, in terms of single missionary women, she would probably be, along with Lottie Moon, Mary Slessor, Gladys Aylward, I would say those three are probably three of the most famous. So, hey, and we've already studied three of them, so here you go. Amy Carmichael. Now remember,
I have a quick question before we start. For our paper that's due on Wednesday,
yeah,
is that biography over the people we're presenting in class, or?
it's different.
Okay.
Yeah, all four of those presentations are different. You have the two in-class ones, and then the two that you turn in. So all four of them should be different people.
Do we have to use people from the book or anyone?
No, you can use anybody.
Okay.
Now, the one you're doing in class, I want it out of that book, right?
Yeah.
But the other one, you can do anybody. If there's a missionary, like for instance, somebody you know from Germany, you'd like to use them as an example, you can. Yep.
Is there a certain format the paper has to be in?
It's just, it's just a report, right?
Have like a lot of sources or like?
I think did I ask?
I did. I haven't checked the syllabus. I just hate writing Turabian. Like, I wanted to write MLAs. I grew up with that.
I know.
It didn't specify, so I was like, well, I was curious.
Let me see. Two biographical studies. Yeah, it doesn't say in the syllabus. Basically, Trabian is the default. In other words, the syllabus don't have to say every time it states an assignment Trabian because, but for this, I'm just going to tell you this.
Right.
If it's neat and clean and consistent, it's not, all over the place, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I appreciate it.
So, the reason for Turabian here is because, maybe you already know this, because Turabian is the accepted style for graduate level theology work. And since a lot of people end up doing that, well, not a lot, but some go on to graduate level theology, we try to get them familiar with Turabian beforehand. That's the reason for it. But MLA is probably more popular. Turabian is also known as Chicago, that's it. So, yeah, but I had to do Turabian too, and I did my doctoral work. And it's like anything else once you get the hang of it, but I'm not going to be that picky about it, all right? I try to be a nice guy. Amy Carmichael. Remember, who's writing the book? A lady, right? Ruth Tucker. And what do we know about Ruth Tucker when it comes to single missionary ladies?
She's brutal.
She's brutal. I think that, and you can give me your opinion, but my opinion, okay, yeah, thank you. If that's too cold, so I can shut one of these windows, okay? Just let me know.
Oh, yeah.
All right? I think that probably Amy Carmichael gets hit the hardest of any of the single gals that she talks about, okay? I get the impression that Ruth Tucker isn't real wild about Amy Carmichael. I don't know if you got that impression when you read it or not. It seems to be that there's more negative than there is positive about Amy. And yet, you can read so many other books about Amy Carmichael and get a completely different perspective. So I would just say, especially in your case, Matthew, if this is the only thing you've read about Amy Carmichael, don't let that be the sole interpretive of Amy, because there's so much more about her. Okay. All right, so let's talk about Amy. Her legacy. Well, she served from 1895 to 1951, 5 years. Now you say that's 6 years, and you're right, but it was probably part of the other 2 years. So 55 years she served. And where?
India.
India. Okay. Now, and she wrote like 35 books. And do you remember when she wrote most of those books?
Weren't they at the end of her life because she was like bedbound?
Yep.
Yeah.
She was an invalid for 20 years or so. And one of the things I admire about Amy Carmichael is she didn't become bitter against God when she was bedridden. She was very she saw that as a special window of time, a chapter in her life. Now, I would just say this to you guys. You're going to find as you work your way through life that there are different chapters. And just like any book, some chapters are more interesting, some are short, some are long, some are positive, some are hard, and if God takes you through a phase in your life when I would encourage you to try to view it as a chapter. And Amy did that at the end of her life, and most of those books were written during that time. She founded the Donover Fellowship, which is the name of the location where she was, and it became kind of her outpost for ministry. And it was a bit controversial. Okay, there were things about the Donover Fellowship we'll see that were a little. She also founded the Sisters of the Common Life, which basically are single gals committed to serving the Lord. Now, this isn't like a nunnery, okay? Don't view this as a Catholic convent, okay? Although there are some people that would probably almost accuse her of creating something that looks like a convent where you take this vow of celibacy and you serve the Lord. That would be a stretch. She was Irish. So, yeah, you think about Scotland. Who are the guys from Scotland that we studied? Some of them are people.
It was David Livings.
Mm-hmm.
Was David Livings.
Mm-hmm. And his father is in-laws, right? And lady. Who's the lady?
Mary?
Yeah, Mary Slessor was Scottish. Yep. And there are others as well. But Amy was born in Ireland in 1867, okay? So if you do the math here, you can see she started in 1895, so you're looking at 28 years of age about when she started there. She came from a pretty wealthy family. I had never heard of Carmichael Flour Mills, but I'm not from Ireland either. My son and his wife did their honeymoon in Dublin. They loved it. Out to the some of the beautiful spots there. But her dad was pretty wealthy, and she was the oldest, or some would say eldest, of 7 children. So, she had leadership ability just by being, any of you the oldest son, firstborn, Ella, you are?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm in the middle of 3 boys. And then she took responsibility after her father's death. And I'm sorry, I do not remember how old she was when her father died, but she had to take some responsibility. So she's learning leadership, and that's going to help her when she ends up in the field. Actually, she didn't feel called to India. That's what she's known for missions in India, but she went to Japan when she's 24 years old. Probably with the idea of spending her life in Japan. But when she was in Japan, she intermingled with a group called the Keziks. The W is silent. It's called the Keziks. Does anybody know who that group was? Well, the Keziks were kind of a higher spiritual life group. Some of them actually believed, not all of them, I wouldn't say all of them, but some of them believed that in this life as a Christian, you could reach a level of sinless perfection. Like I had a student here, I don't know, 8, 9 years ago, whose grandparents believed that they had reached sinless perfection as Christians. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine any Christian saying, it's a theological thing. They believe that the Spirit works in a way that you can actually literally pass from one level to another where you no longer commit sin. It's weird. Actually, there was a hymn that came out of the Keswick movement that we sing. I don't know if you guys have sung it. It's an older hymn. You familiar with this hymn, Higher Ground? Lord, lift me up and help me stand by faith on heaven's table and a higher plane than I have found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Did they have that hymn in Germany?
I don't think so.
Okay. Have you've never heard it? You have? Have you ever heard it? When I was growing up, I was saved in high school, but we used to sing that hymn all the time. And I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I onward bound, Lord, lead me on to higher ground. That comes from the Keswick movement. The idea that we can move up into different planes of spirituality, rather than what I believe the Bible teaches is a gradual growth that sometimes involves lapses, struggling, but a trajectory that takes us up. So she got kind of involved in that group. She only stayed there for 15 months. Does anybody remember why? It was really was pretty simple. It was the culture and the language really, really difficult for her. And she had a really hard time with that. Okay. And, she saw people who had become missionary shipwrecks. And she even suffered from a nervous breakdown. So there were a lot of things happening that kind of discouraged her. Now, I don't know, you talk about a nervous breakdown, exactly what is a nervous breakdown? And I'm not a psychologist, nor am I a biblical counselor by profession. I would understand a nervous breakdown to be essentially an emotional, traumatic experience that renders you incapacitated. You just can't function. You become dysfunctional. When I was a student here, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but Dr. David Nettleton, for whom we named this building over here, my sophomore year, he actually suffered a kind of a breakdown. I wouldn't call it a full-fledged nervous breakdown, but he actually had to step down. He was a great man of God. He recovered and he went on to pastor a church and had a great conclusion to his ministry. But so is this the kind of thing that Adoniram Judson faced? We talk about him going into depression. Is a nervous breakdown the same thing as depression? They're probably related, but I'm guessing if you were to look up specific definitions, you'd find that they're different. A nervous breakdown it often comes about because of overload. And you become so overloaded that the machinery can't process everything anymore. It's like having a giant mill. You pour so much grain into it, it stops. It's dysfunctional. That's often what happens in a nervous breakdown. She experienced that. So she ends up moving her ministry to Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. You know where Sri Lanka is? I thought I had a map.
Is it on the east side of India?
It's right on the south. India comes down like this. It's right down there at the bottom. Little tiny place. I think the Olympics several years ago the Summer Olympics were actually held in Sri Lanka one year. Yeah, it's a really nice place, but it's down by the southern tip of India. And she wasn't there very long either. Here's another case of somebody that's having a hard time figuring out where they fit. And have we come across anybody like that before? They kind of bounced around until they settled into a place. David Brainerd, to some degree, kind of struggled with that. He never left the Native American context, but he was in 2 or 3 different places before he felt like he was settling in and things were happening. We haven't studied C.T. Studd yet, right? He's going to experience the same thing. He's known for his ministry in Africa, but he was in 2 other places before that. So she finally goes back to Britain, and she's just kind of discouraged. Japan didn't work, Sri Lanka didn't work. And so now what? And so she ends up going to India, and she spends the next 55 years there with not a single furlough. She basically spends the rest of her life there. Well, most of the rest of her life. 55 years. And I don't remember exactly what year she went there. You guys happen to find that out. Let me see here. Okay. 15 months in Japan, and yeah. After a short time, she left Ceylon and returned home, but after less than a year, okay, there we go. In the British Isles, she was back in Asia, this time in India, where she'd stayed more than Yeah, so she was only back home for a short time. I mean, it's like she knew she had a drive to be in Asia as a missionary, but just hard time figuring out where. And a lot of people quit during that phase. Okay, they just feel like, I can't figure this out. This must not be God's will. And she kept trying. Okay, so don't feel discouraged if you're bouncing around a little bit at the beginning. Not that you should try to, but if it happens, it doesn't mean that you're somehow out of God's will. And I think, she is famously known for her ministry to children, child widows. Does anybody know what the Indian population at least used to think pretty commonly about widows? There was a stigma that widows would have in India, and some still hold this, but it's not as common as it used to be. Well, the idea is if a man dies and leaves a widow, somehow in the spirit world, and all that, the widow had something to do with his death. She's somehow responsible. And so she becomes like bad luck. And there are some people that wouldn't even walk in the shadow of a widow. If she's walking on the other side of the street, she's casting a shadow. Some people would actually try to avoid even stepping on her shadow. And so imagine child widows. And when we say children, some of these people were promised in marriage as early as 8 and 9 years of age. Some of them got married at 12. And sometimes they were fairly older men. It's just really, really different, unusual. And so this man gets sick and dies. He might be 50, she might be 13. Just really strange. And so now she's a child widow, and guess what? Nobody will marry her again because they're afraid that somehow she's cursed, or there's something wrong with her spiritually that is dangerous. And this is bad. Temple prostitutes, some of them would become temple prostitutes because of that. They had nowhere to go. There was no support financially for widows. Paul talks about supporting widows in 1 Timothy 5. But in a culture like this, if you're a widow, you are on your own. Some of them had to go to begging. Some of them tried to go back home, and some were rejected. And so some of them went into temple prostitution. It's the only way most people end up in temple prostitution, or most people end up in prostitution, period, end up there for financial reasons. They're not doing it for sexual pleasure. They're doing it because they have to be able to eat. So it's really sad. Orphans, sometimes were also, neglected, and not sometimes, but so this is what she was facing, right? And she gave her life to helping people. Do you remember widow burning was common in those days? Sometimes widows were actually burned at the stake or burned in some way because they felt that they were somehow responsible for the husband's death. So they would actually sometimes burn them on the burning pile of their husband instead of burying the guy that died. They'd sometimes burn them, and they would throw the widow right on top of the burning flames of her husband's pyre, they called it. We just think about that. It's weird. And she's walking into this, She's from Great Britain, right? Which is a totally different way of looking at things. So the Donovan Fellowship, well, that was kind of a humanitarian ministry. In other words, she's helping these widows, child widows, and temple prostitutes and orphans, and she would adopt some of them as her own. And there weren't a lot of adoption laws. You basically just took them into your home, and so she raised money to try to help provide food and clothing, shelter for these people. And she was quite the evangelist. Amy Carmichael evangelized who knows how many thousands of children during her lifetime. Amazing ministry of evangelism. Insulation from other missionaries in the area. Okay, this is where our author gets a little bit critical of her. Are you cold? Anybody cold? I can shut this if you are. Okay. She was very, very, very strict about regulations and about godly standards. So missionaries, let's say they would have a retreat someplace. They invite all the missionaries who were in that region, in India to come, and they would do things like play games, do projects like yarn, knitting, and things like that. And your author says, you know, that she considered some of those things frivolous and they weren't going to help them on to spiritual maturity. And so she prohibited her children from participating in some of those activities because she felt that they would be detrimental to them spiritually. And you can imagine what that did for her reputation among the other missionaries. You know, they looked at her as, you know, Miss Holier Than Thou, you know, and they felt like she was pointing the finger at them. They were being worldly by doing these things. Your author is pretty graphic. She even says that, you know, she had a hard time using the word leg when referring to somebody because it was, you know, it was indecent to refer to somebody's leg. So, you know, I'm just telling you, don't, even though some of that may have been true, don't let that completely color your understanding of Amy Carmichael. Yes, she was very protective, but she viewed these. I mean, look who she's investing in: prostitutes, you know, orphans, child widows, and she felt a responsibility to protect them. They'd come out of a very vulnerable lifestyle, and so, you know, to her credit, she's trying to shelter them from further harm and exposure, but in doing so, she created enemies. In fact, do you remember that at one point, some of the other missionaries actually signed a petition to get Amy Carmichael out of India? They tried to get her removed from India. So whatever it was that happened, it created some big controversy. Extreme forms of modesty. But what is an extreme form of modesty, you know? I mean, look, our dress code here at Faith, if you had been back in Omaha before 1967 and you could see the way the students and faculty would dress today, they'd probably throw stones at you. Tell you, you know, you're just worldly. You know, this is a dishonor to our Lord Jesus Christ, right? I mean, you know, so what do you I can't really define what extreme form of but one of the things that she felt was you can't show your legs. Well, look, in America in 1920, if you were a female tennis player, guess what? You could not show your legs. They wore long flowing dresses to play tennis in because it was considered indecent to show your ankles or your, you know, high socks and dresses. So, you know, a lot of that's a matter of opinion. And she was dictatorial, but you have to understand, if you have a group of girls like that, temple prostitutes, orphans, not just girls, but guys, boys too, if you don't have a strong hand of control, you're going to lose whatever control you have, right? Because these kids had no sense of rules and regulations, respect for authority. They hated people. They were children who were full of hatred and full of bitterness. And so she had to be very, very strong in her leadership to maintain control. So there are two sides to the story, is all I'm trying to say. Yeah, total separation from any form of non-Christian practice, knitting, athletics. And she used Zechariah 4:6, according to this author, which I have never understood. Does anybody happen to remember what that verse says? Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. Well, in Zechariah, that has nothing to do with this type of thing, okay? But apparently she thought that those were things that the Spirit of God was not in. You know, knitting, these were worldly activities. I mean, I would probably ask her, why does the Apostle Paul use so many illustrations from the sports world if that's not a good idea, you know? Knitting, colors. Look, my mom was saved in a United Brethren church back in the 1920s. No, not 20s, 30s, late 30s. And she was not allowed to wear anything but black, gray, and white. No colors. No, what were those called? Street? What's that one? My wife gets these ones. These.
Nail polish?
Yeah, but there's something street. One of them, the ones you stick on. Color Street, Color Street. You guys, are you familiar with Color Street? I am, just because my wife gets it, okay? I just put them on my toenails. Johnson. No, just kidding. But I mean, you know, and my mom, but my mom later on, she came out of that. She was a very classy dresser. My mom wore a lot of color. But at that stage, if you wore anything besides black, white, and gray, you know, any makeup, anything, you know, no earrings, no jewelry. So it wasn't just this. There were a lot of people that held positions like that. Just imagine having a tattoo. Dealing with singleness. Do you think Amy Carmichael ever struggled with singleness? She did. Ladies, I don't know what God has for you. Well, not for sure, but but I would just say this. I would say to any lady that, you know, is single and, you know, time is going on and nobody's showing up. I would say this. There's nothing wrong with hiding feelings of discouragement or, you know, doubt, or it doesn't do any good to hide those things. Find somebody that you can share that with. And that's not true just about singleness, but anything. There should be somebody in your life that you can share those difficult. My daughter, Sarah, got married at 34. I don't think you knew Sarah, Daniel's older sister. She's redheaded. She married a guy that's about ready to start his residency for urology surgery. And she taught in a Christian school for 10 years. And when she first started teaching, she said to me, Dad, I almost feel a little hesitant to become a teacher because I feel like this might be a lifelong commitment to being single, because a lot of people that start off as single teachers end up retiring as single teachers. Not everybody. But I appreciated her attitude. She said, you know, this is what I feel God wants me to do right now. And if God wants me to find a husband, she was going to a small church and there just wasn't anybody there. And all of a sudden this guy comes in, you know, who's going to go to medical school at Iowa City and joins the church. He's a fairly new believer. He'd only been saved about 5 years. So she was a much more mature Christian than he was at the time. And, but they ended up getting married in a COVID wedding in our basement. And it was fun. She got to wear a dress. She got to walk down the aisle, which is a stairway, down to our basement. And I walked her down the stairs. That's weird, tripping on that long dress. But, you know, you just never know. If God wants you married, you can be out in the middle of nowhere and he's going to bring the guy along, or the gal, you know. She struggled with it. She confesses to that. I don't know when she confessed it, but, you know. And so she forms the Sisters of the Common Life in order to try to encourage other single gals who want to commit their lives to serving the Lord. And so that fellowship, you know, the common life had to do with a life of singleness and serving the Lord and committed to the Lord. But along comes one of the most famous missiologists of the 20th century, Stephen Neal. If you were to study, you know, missiology more in depth, you would come across the name Stephen Neal. He was an Anglican, all right? She's from where? Country was she from?
Ireland.
Ireland. Okay, he was English, and he was an Anglican, but a really, really intelligent man, very profound in his understanding of missions and missions history and all that. I don't think there's a picture of him in the book, but he's very well known, and they were interested in each other. But and I don't remember how much detail she goes into in talking about Stephen Neal, but it did not work out. Yeah. From Neal's perspective, it was a stormy relationship. Let me just read part of it here real quickly. Carmichael was accused of, by some, being a dictator, particularly some of those who came from Dohnavur to work with her, including the Neal family. So when they first came, they had that impression of her. She's dictatorial. When they came in 1924, the parents, both physicians, their daughter and their son, Stephen Neal, who had graduated from Cambridge University in England. Within 6 months after their arrival, the elder Neals had severed their ties with Donovan, but Stephen continued on for more than a year. Carmichael was impressed with his brilliance, particularly his quick grasp of the language, but she resented his efforts to change things God had already ordained. You hear that? She had this idea that, it's the way God has ordained it, and we're not going to do that. Well, what do you mean ordained? If you're talking about scripture, that's one thing. If you're talking about methodology, you see what I'm saying? She had that. She's very strong-willed that way. And so she didn't want to bring the Donover children in contact with the outside. This she viewed as perilous. So Stephen Neal was dismissed from Donover eventually. Think of that. And then for Carmichael, it was, quote, one of the saddest nights of my life, end quote. There had previously been an altercation that caused a dreadful time of distress. She wrote in her diary, never such known before. I am beginning to sink. Lord, save me, end quote. A year after Neal left Donover, she wrote to a friend, I long over him still, miss him and want him and long to be won in affection. The scab is not even beginning to skin over. It's just red raw. So did she have feelings for this guy? Yeah, really strong feelings, and she expressed them. But he was also distressed. He wrote, during that first year, fellow Christians had brought into my life such darkness and suffering that it took me many years to recover from the injuries, and the scars are still there. Neal recalled his initial meeting with her as an impression of power, that not even the smallest disagreement was permitted. Those who came to Donover found it to be a myth. The compound was thoroughly separated from the surrounding area and flooded with Europeans. He later confessed, I gave my whole soul to Donover, but his time spent there only brought him lifelong wounds. Then he wrote, some of the experiences of my first year in India were so excessively painful that by January 1926, 2 years later, the darkness was complete. A year in England helped, but this time of trouble did not really clear itself up until 1933, 7 years later. I mean, so this little romance thing, it was a big deal for both of them, right? So just, this real life, when you study these, that's what I appreciate about, whether she's exaggerating things or not, the fact is she's willing to say these people are real people with real struggles. So she wrote a lot, she had her fall, leading to 20 years as an invalid. She continued the burden for children and entertain them as she was able. And then she died at the ripe old age of 83 in 1951. And so if you were to ask anybody today, what is Amy Carmichael most known for? The answer is?
Children, like ministry of the children.
Yeah, and writing. And a lot of her writing reflects that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is preserved. In the case of like David Brainerd, for example, how do we know about David Brainerd? Well, he wrote these diaries, these journals that his father-in-law-to-be published. In her case, she wrote and published them herself. And just, so that's, yeah.
So in her case, she ended up being single her whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think if somebody ends up being single their entire life, that means that God gave them the gift of singleness? Because if she still really struggled with that failed relationship and whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always struggled with the title, Gift of Singleness. I understand the sentiment, but for instance, there are some people who are single for a while and then get married, like my daughter. There are others that get married early and then they're widowed, they never get married again. So, what is the gift? I don't tend to view it as much as a specific gift, but just God's grace grace means gift, right? Charis comes from a word that means gift. I view singleness as something for which God gives the grace, the strength to live in light of it. Just like somebody, for instance, if somebody gets injured for life, we call that the gift of being disabled, the gift of disablement. We probably wouldn't call it that, but we would just say that God gives them the ability, the grace to live within that. So, because if you use here's why I say this, Ella. If you refer to the gift of singleness right away, every single gal is going to ask the question, what? Do I have it? Did God give me that gift? And I would prefer not to direct any gal in the direction of that thinking. but just ask the question, you know, where does God have me right now, and how can I best use the condition I'm in right now, whether it's single or married, you know, to bring honor to Him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We're quick to label things that maybe, you know, maybe better left unlabeled. Yeah. We had single gals in our field, you know, and some of them did better than others with it. But, mhm. Are there men who are single? Yeah. Yeah. Henry Martin never got married. David Brainerd was going to, he didn't. So there's Sri Lanka. I do have a map of it there. Right on the tip of India, down there. A little teardrop coming down off of India. All right, we got to at least start into this one, okay? Anybody here ever seen the movie Inn of the Sixth Happiness? I'm guessing you haven't because it was produced back in the 60s. And
I feel like I have. I don't remember.
Okay. I'm going to encourage you to watch it, maybe on break or something. It's not real long. She was actually alive when they made the movie, so she was able to critique it, all right, which is cool. I'll talk more about the movie here at the end. Gladys Aylward, wow, born in London in 1902, okay? Right at the turn of the century. Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford, and all those guys. But she's in London. She began working at the age of 14 as a parlor maid. So a lot of entertaining. She learned a lot about the entertaining world. Now, you know what's interesting about that? What does a parlor maid have to do? Have to receive guests, help guests. What does she do when she first goes to China? She's at an inn. And she's receiving guests and making them feel hospitable. Her ministry is hospitality. So it's interesting. God uses what she was as a young girl to prepare her for the future. She did live a life of carousing for a time. You know, she was kind of a loose liver for a while, right? She wanted to have fun. And being a parlor maid was probably a bit boring, so she found ways to spice it up a little bit, if you know what I mean. And somebody who's left unnamed, some stranger, came to town and ministered, and she came to Christ. How many famous men were led to Christ by somebody we'll never know about? D.L. Moody, you know, Charles Spurgeon. I was talking to my brother yesterday. We talked about Billy Graham came to Christ as somebody that nobody ever knows about. You know, same thing here. So she applies to what's that mission? What's the CIM?
Continental?
Not Continental.
Is it the China Inland?
China Inland Mission. Started by? Yeah, Hudson Taylor. Remember when he first started, he was going out with the Christian Evangelization Society, CES. He left that because of all the, you know, struggled with finances and stuff, and he ended up forming the China Inland Mission. But she was rejected. Why? There was one main thing that they didn't, they said, you're not prepared in this area. What was it? Gladys Aylward was not a student, and I say that respectfully. She had a hard time learning. And yet, this is what's interesting. We're a Bible college, and I've spent my entire career as in a Bible college. But never get the idea that only those who have a formal Bible education, you know, can be qualified to serve. And she'll demonstrate, you know, as we move along, that she definitely could be qualified to serve. So she was only 28 years old. You say, what do you mean only 28? But for a single gal to go at that age was considered pretty young, you know? And she was academically limited. She wasn't mentally challenged or anything, just wasn't a bookworm. My brother, one that made the map over there hanging up, is really talented, but man, he never graduated from high school. Couldn't sit still long enough. But she determined to go anyway. She had a very strong will. She said, I believe God. She had such a strong conviction that God wanted her to go as a missionary that she said, I'm going to go one way or the other. And she did. So how'd she do this? She's continuing to work as a parlor maid. And as she makes enough money, she goes to the train station and she sets a little bit more aside. She has to trust the guy there, you know. She deposits a little bit more and each time, you know, until finally she has enough money built up to be able to take the train to China. So she catches a train. I remember she's in London, right? She has to go through Europe, Russia, and even Siberia to find. And not only that, but she's also going during a time of war. Okay? Who is China at war with?
Is it Russian?
Not Russia. Japan. Okay? And so there are troops that she is with on the train, and she just wants to keep going straight into China. And finally, the train stops at a certain place, and all the soldiers get off, and she's sitting there by herself on the train, and somebody says, this is the last stop, you have to get off here. Well, as it turns out, she should have gotten off a few stops earlier because she would have been closer to a main city. But because she went that far, they told her you have to get off. She had to get off and find her way back. And it's bitter cold. It's winter. I mean, this lady had a lot of pluck. She was very, very determined. And so I don't know how much of it she walked or whether she was able to catch a ride with somebody on a horse or something. But she goes back several miles back to up to a city. So she gets there, and to make matters worse, she's working with somebody that's not really wild about having her around. Imagine going to the mission field, being all excited, and finally get there, you know, and your dream is coming true, and all of a sudden you find out that your coworker really doesn't care about you being there. How would you feel, you know? We're supposed to work together. In fact, as you might remember from your reading, eventually she kicks Gladys out. They're both pretty strong-willed. So what kind of work did she do again? What's her job? Her coworker.
Hospitality.
Yeah. So it's a mule tier stop. People who are it's people who are carrying supplies on mules. Okay, mules was a great way to haul things. So the commercial people were coming through. They would stop there and they would lodge there for the night and then take off the next day. So she had to check them in, receive payment, you know, assign them a room and all that. And so what is she going to learn? She's going to learn a language. That was her language school. I don't know how well Gladys Aylward learned Mandarin, okay? But I do know she learned it well enough to communicate. And the way she learned it was the hard way. By trying to figure out what these guys are saying. She had to handle money, so she had to make sure they weren't ripping her off. You know what I mean? But she learned it. She learned the language. So eventually, she gets in a fight, not a fist fight, but an argument with her hostess, and she finally said, "You're out of here." So Gladys has to leave. Don't look at her as this, you know, gentle little, you know, meek and mild little lady. No, she's pretty tough stuff. Okay. Well, she ends up getting a job as a foot inspector. What is that all about? What did a foot inspector do and why? What's going on here?
Did they not wrap the feet of like little girls so that they would not grow? And they didn't want that anymore, so she would go around and like make sure that they don't do that anymore.
Yeah. There was this idea, and some of it was spiritually induced, that if a girl has big feet, it's ugly, or it might even be a curse, you know, and so they wrapped their feet. And I mean, if you look at pictures online of some of that you can see some photos there, it's just, you know, imagine your fingers just, your hand looking like this because you had it wrapped up. And you imagine your foot looking that same way. It was horrible. Just ruined them, their posture, they had back issues. So finally, China passed a law that it is forbidden to do foot wrapping. How are they going to enforce it? Foot inspectors. And it might not seem like it, but being a foot inspector was actually kind of a prestigious position. She got paid decently for that, okay? She has the authorization of the Chinese government behind her to do this, you know? And she did it. And she actually gets reputed as a leader, and it's time to go, so we'll have to stop there, but we'll come back to that. Oh, yeah. Bless you. Gladys Hill, we'll come back here on Wednesday.
Dr. Mark,
Yeah.
I'm fairly certain